Last week, we began a study of the subject of marriage under attack. And we gave you a few statistics in the beginning that 1 out of every 2 marriages are ending in divorce. We talked about the increase of men and women living together. We talked about the infidelity of adultery committed in the marriage relationship and how prevalent it is becoming. And all of this is a breakdown of the institution that God designed it for the betterment of man. Now we're looking at passages from the Old Testament to show God's consistent attitude, although the law is a little different, well, a lot different, because under the old law, if you did sexual immorality, you were taken out in stone. Well, that doesn't happen today, but that was God's statement in the beginning, because he said that was evil, and he wanted to keep the evil from permeating his people, and so he took a very stern look and had a very stern penalty for those who violated the marriage covenant. And we finished up last Lord's Day looking at Malachi chapter 2. And we noticed in Malachi 2 verse 16 that God hates divorce. That was God's attitude at the end of the Old Testament, that God hated divorce. It was something that he was not pleased with, something that he had not designed, and something that he believed was a detriment to the relationship of marriage. And we'll see that more as we get into the new covenant. Now, in these passages, it covers the altar with tears. Why is the altar covered with tears? Because it's unhappy, it's a defilement, it's a breakdown. Divorce is a very emotional thing to go through. Divorce is something that brings a lot of heartache, brings a lot of tears, brings a lot of heartache to the people that are involved in it, to the children who are victims of it. There's just a lot of issues, emotional issues, that happen when a marriage breaks down. And so God understood that. He said it covers the altar with tears, because men and women are crying to him because of the pain and the awful feeling that divorce brings, and the separation that it does, not just between the husband and wife, but between children and parents. And so it covers the altar with tears. It's something that God is touched by, and something that God does not like, and something that God wants men to try to avoid. It's breaking the covenant. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's important for us to get this principle. It breaks the covenant. When you and I, or any man and woman, enter a marriage relationship with a spouse, you make a covenant, you make an agreement, you make a promise, and God's going to hold you to that promise. God's going to hold you to that covenant. And when you break that covenant for any other reason other than the one that God gives, God is not pleased. He is not happy. And he does not accept it, because he did not give you the out just to walk out of a marriage because you get tired of it, or you fall out of love, or you see something you want better, or you have a little difficulty and you don't want to work on it, you just want to walk away from it. All those things are sin. And all those things will bring sin into your life. And it will bring pain, heartache, and tears to the people who are involved, and even by other people who are touched by the action. Parents, grandparents, just a litany of problems and tears and heartache. And so God hates that because of what it does to mankind and what it does to society. Dealing treacherously. It's dealing in a treacherous way. It's dangerous. It's dealing treacherously. It's someone who is not considering the alternative, is not considering what the outcome of this is going to be. You're dealing in a haphazard way. When you're dealing treacherously, you're taking serious steps that have serious consequences. And you're dealing treacherously. You're dealing in a way that is not right. It's not honorable. And God says he hates that. Covers garments with violence. Listen to the wording that God gives here in Malachi. It covers one garment with violence. It's a violent act. It tears families apart. It tears your relationship apart. It's violent. And it has a lot of pain associated with it. God hates divorce. Why does God hate divorce? Because of what it causes, because of the pain, the anxiety, the destruction of the home, the separation of man and wife, the separation of family from their fathers, from their mothers, and you have a one-parent home. There is just problem on top of problem. That's why God hates it. That's why God made a very strict law in why and how men could end the marriage relationship. It's a very serious relationship. And when one enters it, he must enter it, and she must enter it with understanding what serious nature this relationship is. And it's not something that you can just get out of lightly. It's not something you can just walk away with without any consequences, without any ramifications. There are going to be things that will happen, things that can affect other people's lives for the rest of their lives. And again, that's why God hates it. It's something that has no good ending. You know, I've heard people talk about a good divorce. I don't know what that is. There is no such thing. When there is a divorce, there is no good divorce. And so we need to understand that God takes a very serious attitude when it comes to people who violate the marriage covenant. And so just look at this. It covers the altar with tears. It breaks the covenant. You're dealing treacherously. Your garment's covered with violence, and God hates the action. Has God changed his mind? No. Absolutely not. God still hates divorce. You say, well, he gives you he does give you one option to get out of it, but that doesn't mean he likes it. That doesn't mean that pleases him, because sin has been involved. The reason that out is given is because sin has been involved, because sin has violated the covenant. And the person that violated the covenant gives the other party the option to get out of it. But I want you to know it still covers the throne of God with tears. Many prayers filled with tears are offered by people who have been torn asunder by a divorce. And it's breaking the covenant. It's breaking the covenant that you entered with your mate. And that's still a serious thing. And it covers, and it's dealing treacherously. It's dealing in a very unhealthy, haphazard way, and you're making a decision that's going to have disastrous consequences. And you're dealing treacherously because you're not dealing honorably. And it covers one's garment with violence because of all the pain that's associated with it. And God hates it now, and he hated it then. He'll always hate it because of what it does to mankind, what it does to the family relationship, and what it does to the home, and in essence, what it's going to do to society. It's all a breakdown, and there's nothing but misery on top of misery. That's why God hates it. And so men must give serious consideration to the danger of entering a relationship and then not fulfilling the obligations of that relationship and ending that relationship in a way that God hates. That makes it a very serious problem and a very serious consequence if one takes this course. Now, let's move to the New Testament. Now, before we move to the New Testament, I want to sum up what we studied under the Old. Under the Old law, God's law was one man, one woman for life. Now, he gave various legislation in Deuteronomy 24 when men's stubbornness and the way their attitude toward their wives began to be less than what God wanted. When they began to treat them like pawns, and when they began to treat them like property, and they were abusing them, God was not happy with that. And so he put some variations in the law in order to curb his attitude and his action to bring it back in line with what God wanted. But God tolerated some things. He tolerated multiple marriage. He tolerated polygamy. He would tolerate some things, but it doesn't mean that God approved of it. He allowed man to do it, but he never approved of it because he knew what pain that it would bring. And sexual immorality, God didn't tolerate that at all. Sexual immorality in a marriage is sin. And under the old law, the penalty for that behavior was death. You were taken out and stoned if you committed adultery. if you had premarital sex before you were married and you were engaged to be married to someone and you violated that agreement that you were going to enter in, you could be taken out and stoned. And if you committed rape and you forced yourself on one, you would end up having to pay a penalty for that, and then you would have to take that person to be your wife and could never divorce her. And then we studied Malachi at great length. God hates divorce. So when we look at the Old Testament, God had the original concept, one man, one woman for life. Sexual immorality was dealt with in a very stern and speedy way. And God did everything he could. When man began to go away from the original pattern, he did many things to try to steer him back to what God wanted to be done. Well, now we get to the New Testament, and we get to the time of Christ, and then the time that would follow after his death and resurrection. What law was the law of God still consistent when we get to the New Covenant? Well, let's see. Let's begin with Matthew 5:32. Well, I say to you that whoever divorces his wife, except for any reason except sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Now, notice this word causes. I want you to center in on this word causes. When somebody unlawfully divorces a mate, they cause adultery to be committed. Now, what does that mean? That means when a man and woman are lawfully married and they are in a binding covenant with themselves and with God, and they willfully break that covenant and they destroy that relationship for a cause not given by God, then they set the table and the temptation for one or both to commit adultery. And that's what the word cause means. It means that you cause this action to be taken because your unlawful ending of the marriage places the temptation of adultery before both mates in order to satisfy the sexual desire that they have. And so you have placed that temptation in front of your mate when you unlawfully divorce them. And if that mate succumbs and commits adultery, God's going to hold you accountable because you set the table for that to happen when you divorced that person when you did not have the ground. Now that's very seriously. That's a change from the old law. The old law is, the old law, you could give her a bill of divorcement, you could remarry, but under the new law, if you divorce her for any other reason other than sexual immorality, and you separate that relationship and you break that covenant, and that person goes and commits adultery because now they don't have a relationship and don't have a husband or a wife in order to satisfy the desire, and they go out elsewhere to get that desire satisfied, and they enter another relationship, that's an adulterous marriage, that's an adulterous relationship. But God's going to hold you accountable for causing that because you got a divorce that you were not authorized to have by God. And so you set the table for that. Now, brother, you need to think about that, friend. You need to think real hard about what this verse says. Because when you unlawfully divorce a spouse, then you are setting the table for destruction. Not just for them, but for you. Whoever applies to anyone, man, woman, Jew, Gentile, doesn't matter. Whether you're Christian or non-Christian, the marriage law applies to everyone. Now, you may not be a believer in God. You may be an atheist. You may be an agnostic. You may be a believer in a foreign God. You have the prerogative to do any of that. But the law of marriage still applies to you. It still applies to you. God's going to hold you accountable to his law, whether you accept it, believe it, or follow it or not. Whoever means anyone. Causes. Guilty by placing temptation before the mate. You made that sin possible. If you would have never divorced that person, then that sin could not have been committed. They would not be tempted to have another sexual relation with someone else and enter another marriage relationship if you had not separated from her or him and divorced them. And so you caused that behavior, you caused that sin to happen. Now, that won't exonerate the one who's committed the sin. They're going to be held accountable for the sin, no doubt about it. They enter another relationship, that's adultery, that's sinful, and God's going to hold that person accountable. But you also are going to be held accountable because you set the table for that by your unlawful action. For fornication, not guilty of the subsequent adultery. For fornication, if I put my mate away because she commits adultery and she becomes unfaithful and she goes with another man, now God recognizes that as a lawful reason to end the marriage, the only reason that He gives to end the marriage. And if that mate is put away by me because she committed adultery, and then she goes out and commits adultery again with someone else, I'm not going to be held accountable for that because I didn't cause that to happen. She did by her actions when she became unfaithful to me. And so again, the person who caused the sin for fornication, that was the reason. If that was the reason and that person goes and gets involved, that's on her, not on me, because I didn't put her in that position. She did by her own action. Married, the divorce, guilty of adultery. You marry someone who has been divorced, but not for the cause of adultery, that is an adulterous relationship. Now listen to me very carefully, ladies and gentlemen. You can have a legal document. You can be divorced in the eyes of the law of the land. But if you were not divorced for the cause of adultery, if you were not divorced for that cause that God gives, and you enter another relationship, that is adultery. Even if the person you marry never was married. Even if the person you married, spouse died, you're still in adultery because you're still bound to that first mate because God doesn't recognize you. You're still bound to that first covenant because God didn't loose you. You see, the law of the land doesn't loose you from God. Now that might loose you legally in the eyes of the land, of the courts of our country, but that doesn't break the bond and the covenant that you made with God. And unless it's for the cause of adultery, God does not recognize it and does not accept it as the ending of the covenant. And so when you marry someone else, then you violate that covenant and you're in adultery. Even if that other person's never been married, or their spouse has died, or even if they have been divorced for the right reason and their mate committed adultery, when you marry them, if that's not the cause of yours, then that is adultery for you and the other person. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it makes it very serious. You're not just talking about your sin, you're bringing somebody else into it. You're bringing someone in that may have a right to marry, but they didn't have a right to marry you. But you bring them into that sin when you enter a relationship that you are not authorized to enter. Now that makes God's law very much more strict than the New Testament. It makes it very strict because the only reason you can get out is for adultery, and if you get out for any other reason, then you violate that law and any subsequent marriage that you have and the person you marry, if God claims it's adultery. Adultery, sexual immorality. Now you're not going to be taken out and stoned to death, but you'll never be accepted by God because you're living in adultery. And if you're living in adultery, you're separated from God because adultery is a sin. Except specifies the innocent and the guilty party. The innocent party who has been sinned against, they have the option by God that they could remarry. And when they remarried, it would not be sinful. It would not be adultery because that bond has been broken by God for that person because she was sinned against. He was sinned against. Now, when they marry, they would have to marry someone that's eligible in by God's pattern, by God's design. They can marry a widower. They could marry one who would also scripturally divorce for adultery. But they couldn't marry someone that was divorced for a cause other than adultery, or they couldn't marry someone that had multiple marriages and was never for the cause of adultery, even though they're not married by the legal term by the law. God says that that person's still bound to the first mate, and if that person who's been divorced scripturally marries, that's going to be sinful, because God does not recognize that, because that person that you marry doesn't have a right to do that. And so, again, the innocent party, that's the one who's been sinned against, yes, they have a right to enter another relationship, but it must be with someone who is eligible by God's definition and not by man's. The Mosaic concession comes to an end. You see, limited under Christ. Under Christ, the Mosaic covenant ends. There's no unshameful conduct. There's no shameful conduct, something short of adultery. That's not in the new law. The new law doesn't give you another out. It doesn't give you an addition to something a little less than adultery. It's not there. It's not there because God didn't put it in there. And so the law of Christ is much more strict than the law in the Old Covenant. Christ's law is stricter than the law of Moses. God's law is very strict. Now, one way it's not strict is that there's not the death penalty. If you commit adultery, you cause your mate to commit adultery, God doesn't authorize the death penalty. Now, that's one thing that is different from the old and new law. But God makes it very clear, that the Mosaic concession in Deuteronomy 24 that we read about shameful conduct or some uncleanness, that it does not carry over to the law of Christ. And so again, the only cause, and we'll see this in just a moment, the only cause that God gives for ending a marriage other than death is for adultery. Now, I want you to notice this. I want us to keep this in our mind. Under Moses, fornication, you were put away by death. You couldn't marry anyone else because you were dead. Under the law of Christ, fornication, you put away by divorce. You can't marry another. There's no marrying another. And so, yes, you're single or you're divorced, but you don't have the right to marry because you committed fornication and you were put away for that ungodly action, and you do not have the right to remarry. Divorce cause short of fornication. Now again, this is when you got a bill of divorcement back in Deuteronomy 24 for some shameful conduct, some uncleanness. That was short of fornication. No divorce for any cause short of fornication. Under the law of Christ, there is no such prohibition. There is no such loophole. And so that contingency is under the old law, but not under the new. Make divorce, no fornication. You can marry another without adultery. If you've got a bill of divorcement, you could marry another. That wouldn't be fornication, and that would not be adultery. But again, remember, you couldn't take that person back. Same situation, but marry another. Now it is adultery. Now, you divorce, but it's not for fornication. You marry another. Now it is adultery. You see, that makes the law of Christ stricter. Man who marries her, not in adultery. The man who marries the woman who has been given a bill of divorcement, he's not in adultery. The man who marries her is in adultery. If you marry one who's not been scripturally divorced, not for the cause of adultery, and you marry that person, you are living in adultery. The first man can't have her. The first man can have her. If he wants to, the first man can have her. Why? Because he can reconcile. She can forgive him. She can forgive him and take him back, and they can put their marriage back together again. Really, that's the best option for him because it's the only way he can have another relationship. And so again, what I want you to see, the laws are not the same. The law of Moses and the law of Christ is different on the subject of marriage. The law of Christ is much stricter. And so anything short of fornication, there is no such thing. You can't get divorced because she's getting old. You can't get divorced because she burns dinner. She can't get divorced because he's a drinker. She can't get divorced because maybe he is not a good breadwinner. None of those things, although they make the marriage difficult, they cause problems in the marriage, it's not cause for divorce. Now I know, in our country you can get divorced if you just don't want to be married anymore. You can, when I lived in Las Vegas, you could go up to a drive-up window and you could end your divorce, you could end your marriage for $125. Now, the law will let you do that. The law may legislate that, but God never will. God never will tolerate that because that is sinful. That is sin. And it's a breakdown of the relationship, and it leads to nothing but more problems, more heartache, more pain, and it destroys the home, breaks up families, makes single parents. Children are going to be affected. Society is going to be affected. It's just a downward spiral into just difficulty. And that's why God hated it. God hated it then, and He hates it now. And so what I want you to see in closing this morning is that there are differences in what was done under the law. Well, in our sexual happy society that we live in, men and women ought to be absolutely ecstatic that the death penalty is no longer enacted here upon adultery. We wouldn't have a population problem. If men committed adultery now, they would be taken out and stoned. That part of the law is not in the law of Christ. And so we need to be grateful for that. But the law is much stricter in the law of Christ because if you marry one who is divorced for other cause other than adultery, then that is an adulterous relationship. Even if that person's free to marry, that is an adulterous relationship. And so what I want you to see as we bring this lesson to a close is that God's law is very strict and very straightforward. That if you marry one who has not been scripturally separated, that means because of the act of adultery, and they are divorced for any other reason, and they enter another relationship, God said that's adultery now. Ladies and gentlemen, I know the world doesn't agree with that. I know the majority of religions will teach that differently. But what you need to do is you need to go in and open your Bible and see if that's exactly what it said. Go back and read Matthew 5:31 and 32. Go back and read it. Go back and study it. And you will see that that's God's law on marriage. And if we're going to respect God, then we're going to have to respect His law on marriage. Next week we'll continue looking at some other passages in the New Testament to further help us understand the strictness of the marriage relationship under the law of Christ. Thank you for listening. And by the way, if you have any questions, if you don't agree and you want to sit down and talk about it, be more than happy to do so. If you come with an open mind and open Bible, I'll be glad to sit down and clarify anything that I've said. If you can show me where I've misused or abused what the text says, I'll correct it. I'll get on this TV program and I'll correct it. But will you have the same courage if you find yourself in a marriage that the world says is legal, God says is adultery? Will you do what you need to do to be right with God? Time will tell. Thank you for listening. Please turn in again next Lord's Day, and we hope you have a blessed day.